This is probably the last extra to my ramblings on PhD funding in the UK. To recap, I discussed the major ways a PhD for a generally scientific-based subject will be funded in the UK, talked about the main ways in which that happens, and then talked about the amount that was funded by, in particular, centres for doctoral training or research councils in general, which is generally the main way that PhDs get funded. I then compared that to the amount that a graduate in a scientific sort of subject would earn if they went straight into the workplace. And there's one thing left that I think I would be interested in talking about, which is the practicalities of living on that income. I compared the pay of a PhD to a graduate job, but never discussed anything about how it is living on it, which is probably the one part I actually have some qualification to say that I actually know what I'm talking about here. Or at least I haven't messed it up yet, which is basically the same thing, right? So it puts all on the same page. PhD students earn around £15,000 as a stipend. This is money that goes into the bank. There isn't income tax, there isn't council tax because you're a student and you don't contribute to national insurance. If you're going to an institution in London, this is different, but from that point on, I'm just going to ignore London because it's London. You get more, the rent is more. So roughly where does this money get you? Again, guesswork and personal experience mostly, but I'll run through the basic picture here. There's something that I've heard about a lot online, which is trying to split the money you spend based on necessities, then money for saving, and money for just having a good time, living your life. Putting a percentage of your money towards essentials, percentage towards savings, percentage towards living your life, and that should make up the money that you have. You should be able to plan that out in advance. The general ones that I've seen see around 25 to 30% of your income on rent, with rent and utilities ticking somewhere between 30 to 40%. Then they go on to put usually 20% as a respectable amount to put into savings. So let's start running through those numbers and how they come about when you're looking at £15,000 as the total amount of money. 30% of that is around £4,500 a year, or £375 a month, which is a more useful way of looking at things when you're talking about rent. That's a very difficult number. If you share a flat, so you have a partner who works, or group with many friends, or group with many partners, that would be doable, just about. But this is well below average for most places in the UK. And because you're working at university, you'll be competing for these places with actual students who need the cheaper end. It's not going to be easy. Realistically, you will spend more than that as a percentage of your income on rent. And rent and utilities, trying to keep them below about 40%, again, is going to be difficult. However, there's a saving grace. The idea that spending this sort of money on rent generally rests on assumptions about how you spend the rest of that money. A big example is that often transport is considered a sizable chunk of your income, i.e., if you're like most people in a developed country and you own a car, you to pay insurance on that, especially if you're a young PhD student age, that's a lot of money. You have to pay some sort of taxes, you have to pay MOT, you have to pay to fuel the thing. That's a very expensive thing. If you don't have a car and you're in a city because you're going to some sort of university or something and you have a reasonable public transport link, it's not that much of your income. Even if you end up getting both a yearly bus pass and the occasional train to see people further away, you could keep this down. I would say then, given that you don't have a very high transport cost, and essentially that's usually one of the few necessities for people who work other than rent and bills, I would say you can get rent, major bills covered for around half your stipend, or half a stipend at £15,000 a year would be £7,500 a year, or £625 a month. that would probably get you rent plus gas, electric, water, and broadband, hopefully. So where does everything else go? The other essential is, of course, food and drink. We'll say 10% of your stipend works out around £28 a week. Again, I'm mathsing off of that £15,000. Now, that's fairly comfortable. You can get sort of your food and drink for less than 10% of your income, as well as cleaning stuff, household rubbish. However, take into account, of course, if you have a takeaway, then that keeps racking up. So over the course of the year, 28 quid a week is reasonable. That would leave roughly 40% of your money, or around £500 a month, left for other forms of fun and putting into savings. I can make no hard numbers to this, but putting away a bare minimum of £250 a month, which is over the course of the year, £3,000 or 20% of your stipend, is reasonable. It's something I've been able to do. And in fact, you can generally put in more than that. So that's the rough breakdown. That's the end of it. 15 grand a year. You'll probably end up spending about half of that on rent and your major bills, because it's very difficult to push things below that unless you're sharing a flat with a lot of other people. That's doable, but of course it's more difficult to do that now you're not a student. You won't get priority places for student rent, for the sort of places that rent for big places of students, and the odds of you knowing people before the start of your PhD to move in with could be quite small. If you're in a long-term relationship, of course, that's different. That's something you can do. But even then, it can be a bit tight on the building that you can get. Beyond that, 50 to 60% on essentials and 20% to put away from savings is a reasonable goal that you can. Finally, I'll just add a couple of extras. I've not considered making extra money on top of this. PhD is basically a full-time job unless you specifically get one part-time. If you want, there are plenty of ways to work a few hours extra here and there, but I haven't put them in to my calculations, partly because 15,000 is such a lovely number to work with, and partly because I didn't want to assume that you got the extra money. In my case, I take a couple of hours extra a week during term time for teaching the university students, and over the course of the year these can add up to a few hundred extra quid. But because of the likelihood of not wanting to work that many hours on top of a full-time job, these aren't going to make massive changes, I don't think. I've assumed you're working full-time for fairly obvious reasons of sense in doing the numbers. If you're working this part-time and doing another job, it becomes very difficult for me to do these calculations. I'll leave with the final note that this is not the only way to work with money from PhD, obviously. I know some people who spend more on rent, maybe rent coming up to around well over 60% of their budget, but are incredibly frugal. And I also know people who flat share incredibly cheaply at the sort of student level where it's less than £100 a week sort of thing, but are much more active because of it. And I also know people who really aren't bothered about putting money away into the savings and just live life and have a good time. Or some who rent cheaply and put in savings but don't take the save on transport idea. However, I hope that was in some way interesting. It certainly made me think trying to write this down. Just putting together the video made me think more seriously about my finances. And I didn't think at the start that I'd be this interested in talking about the money of a PhD, but it ended up as 3 entire videos, so I hope someone else finds a use for it. But are much more active because of it. And I also know people who really aren't bothered about putting money away into the savings and just live life and have a good time. Or some who rent cheaply and put in savings but don't take the save on transport idea. However, I hope that was in some way interesting. It certainly made me think trying to write this down. Just putting together the video made me think more seriously about my finances. And I didn't think at the start that I'd be this interested in talking about the money of a PhD, but it ended up as 3 entire videos, so I hope someone else finds a use for it. I'll call that all for today then.